The Prime Minister has told the European President the EU needs to change because British people are not happy with the status quo. However, it's emerged that Germany and France are drawing up plans for closer integration of Eurozone countries. So, David Cameron has quite a task ahead of him, trying to renegotiate the UK's membership. Tomorrow, details on the EU referendum bill will be announced after the Queen's speech, and then Mr Cameron will take his plans to EU leaders. On Thursday morning, he's going to be meeting the Danish Prime Minister. At lunchtime, he'll then fly to the Netherlands for talks with the Prime Minister there, Mark Rutte. He'll then go to Paris for dinner with the French President François Hollande. And then on Friday, he'll be meeting the Polish Prime Minister before then holding talks with the real EU power broker, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel in Berlin. The charm offensive began last night, though, David Cameron meeting the EU President Jean-Claude Juncker in Chequers. Eurozone reforms will be further discussed this evening in Brussels, and a number 10 advisor is expected to attend. Well, let's speak to Nina Schick from Open Europe, an independent policy think tank on the European Union. She joins us now from Westminster. Good afternoon to you, Nina. David Cameron has admitted it's going to be a tough task to get any reforms past these EU member state heads. How much tougher do you think it's likely to be with these reports coming out that France and Germany want to actually tighten up Eurozone integration?
Well, the report that we saw leaked was a preliminary working draft between France and Germany on the future of the Eurozone. And the reason why it was interesting was that they said effectively that they might not have treaty change in the near future, which is something that, of course, David Cameron has said he'd like to achieve. However, it's important to point out that that is not a changing of the French and German position. They certainly haven't ruled it out in the longer term. And the question now is, because this is such an important issue, there will be a lot of background noise, but until we actually see the specifics of reform, it's hard to draw judgment. Of course, it's not going to be an easy task, and Cameron has his work cut out for him. But until we get some more details of how the negotiations are going, I think we have to reserve judgment.
Does it not signal, though, that the German Chancellor and the French President are on a completely different page to the Prime Minister, because all EU leaders talk about reform, but for each EU leader, reform means something different?
Well, interestingly, if you look at what is on the table in terms of reform, and Open Europe has actually laid it out in our EU Reform Index, so many of the reforms that Cameron is actually pushing for is something that in Europe they also push for. So when it comes to economic competitiveness, some of the democratic changes that we want to see in Europe. So the challenge for Cameron now is to be able to present his EU reform agenda without talking about British exceptionality, but wrapping it up in a package for the future direction of the EU. And in fact, it's a terrific opportunity for the EU to answer some of the existential questions that we see about further Eurozone integration, about the nature of the club. Is it going to be a club that's more flexible, that allows members to integrate up to further levels, or is it going to be a union where there's one future movement of integration and direction?
It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because what David Cameron is doing isn't unprecedented. Member states have before been allowed to change their relationship with the EU in the past.
Absolutely. And we are already looking at a political reality. I mean, Europe, we already have a multifaceted, multi-layered Europe. The question is, can you have some kind of institutional wrapping around that and recognize what is already the political reality? And if David Cameron was very, very successful in his reform drive, and I think this is a process that doesn't end after the referendum, then you have the EU being thought of as a club where the single market is the basis of EU membership and many other things are optional. So if the Eurozone wants to go ahead with further integration, as indeed is necessary, then that's absolutely fine. But the Eurozone members shouldn't write the rules for the rest of the EU.
We talked through some of David Cameron's schedule a few moments ago. He's got to convince 27 EU leaders that the UK is a special case and needs some adjustments within the EU. Just how valuable is the UK to the EU in terms of how much power does David Cameron have in negotiating?
Well, I think the EU is well aware, at least the power players in the EU are well aware that the UK is a very valuable member to the EU. We're talking about at a time when, European security is much under threat. We need to look at what's going on in Ukraine, what's happening in the Middle East. Losing one of the big military powers of the EU would be a blow. We already, also from the economic perspective, liberally economic countries like Germany know that if the UK were to leave, that would change the way that the EU votes in terms of economic liberal policies. We saw today in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, one of Germany's leading dailies, a lot of German businesses coming out and saying that the EU would suffer if the UK were to leave. We're also on target to be the biggest country in the EU. And of course, the EU is facing a lot of demographic challenges. And by 2030, the UK could actually have a bigger economy than Germany. So I think the people who really know and understand this debate realize that the UK is a very valuable member of the EU.
Just before we go, David Cameron, with his list of changes ahead of the referendum, what is it he wants changed essentially in the UK's relationship with the EU? I know that immigration and freedom of movement is high on his agenda, benefits and welfare payments to migrants, but a lot of people have pointed out that within the EU there are UK nationals living abroad that are claiming benefits from the countries that they live in. Again, it seems to be one rule for one rule for another. How much do you think David Cameron is likely to get from his wish list, if you like?
So first of all, I think it's very clear that David Cameron is coming into these negotiations with an extremely strong democratic mandate. I think he's in a better position to push forward the reform agenda than he was 2 years ago. I mean, the only other leader in Europe who is probably as strong as he is right now is Angela Merkel. So although it's clear that the UK cannot dictate terms, Cameron should really push for a very ambitious reform agenda. Secondly, on the issue of immigration, essentially what David Cameron is proposing is that one rewrites the rules around access to welfare, specifically around in-work benefits, which EU migrants who come to work in the UK receive, and it acts as a subsidy. And because the UK's welfare system is non-contributory and universal, unlike European welfare systems, the continental system, it's essentially about making that a level playing field. By doing that, you're able to still preserve the fundamental principle of free movement. So this is something that I think is very negotiable. And finally, I'd like to add that, again, this is not about British exceptionality, and it shouldn't be termed as such. It has to be about making the EU as a whole more competitive and more viable and able to function better in the 21st century. Because obviously, if you look at the crises that have been hitting the EU over the past few years, it's clear that something needs to change and something isn't working.
OK, really interesting to speak to you this afternoon. Nina Schick from Open Europe, thank you.